Some of them were sipping wine, others were playing cards, others chess, other groups were chatting together, and many were smoking cigarettes while they waited for the coming duels. Nearly all of them wore colored caps. There were white caps, green caps, blue caps, red caps, and bright yellow ones, so all the 5 corps were present in strong force. In the windows at the vacant end of the room stood 6 or 8 narrow-bladed swords with large protecting guards for the hand, and outside was a man at work sharpening others on a grindstone. He understood his business, for when a sword left his hand, one could shave himself with it. It was observable that the young gentlemen neither bowed to nor spoke with students whose caps differed in color from their own. This did not mean hostility, but only an armed neutrality. It was considered that a person could strike harder in the duel, and with a more earnest interest, if he had never been in a condition of comradeship with his antagonist. Therefore, comradeship between the corps was not permitted. At intervals, the presidents of the 5 corps have a cold official intercourse with each other, but nothing further. For example, when the regular dueling day of one of the corps approaches, its president calls for volunteers from among the membership to offer battle. 3 or more respond, but there must not be less than 3. The president lays their names before the other presidents, with the request that they furnish antagonists for these challengers from among their corps. This is promptly done. It chanced that the present occasion was the battle day of the Red Cap Corps. They were the challengers, and certain caps of other colors had volunteered to meet them. The students fight duels in the room which I have described, 2 days in every week, during 7.5 or 8 months in every year. This custom had continued in Germany 250 years. To return to my narrative, a student in a white cap met us and introduced us to 6 or 8 friends of his who also wore white caps, and while we stood conversing, 2 strange-looking figures were led in from another room. They were students panoplied for the duel. They were bareheaded. Their eyes were protected by iron goggles which projected an inch or more. The leather straps of which bound their ears flat against their heads were wound around and around with thick wrappings which a sword could not cut through. From chin to ankle they were padded thoroughly against injury. Their arms were bandaged and rebandaged, layer upon layer, until they looked like solid black logs. These weird apparitions had been handsome youths, clad in fashionable attire 15 minutes before, but now they did not resemble any beings one ever sees unless in nightmares. They strode along, with their arms projecting straight out from their bodies. They did not hold them out themselves, but fellow students walked beside them and gave the needed support. There was a rush for the vacant end of the room now, and we followed and got good places. The combatants were placed face to face, each with several members of his own corps about him to assist. 2 seconds, well padded, and with swords in their hands, took their stations. A student belonging to neither of the opposing corps placed himself in a good position to umpire the combat. Another student stood by with a watch and a memorandum book to keep record of the time and the number and nature of the wounds. A gray-haired surgeon was present with his lint, his bandages, and his instruments. After a moment's pause, the duelists saluted the umpire respectfully. Then one after another the several officials stepped forward, gracefully removed their caps, and saluted him also, and returned to their places. Everything was ready now. Students stood crowded together in the foreground, and others stood behind them on chairs and tables. Every face was turned toward the center of attraction. The combatants were watching each other with alert eyes. A perfect stillness, a breathless interest reigned. I felt that I was going to see some wary work, but not so. The instant the word was given, the 2 apparitions sprang forward and began to rain blows down upon each other with such lightning rapidity that I could not quite tell whether I saw the swords or only flashes they made in the air. The rattling din of these blows, as they struck steel or paddings, was something wonderfully stirring, and they were struck with such terrific force that I could not understand why the opposing sword was not beaten down under the assault. Presently, in the midst of the sword flashes, I saw a handful of hair skip into the air as if it had lain loose on the victim's head, and a breath of wind had puffed it suddenly away. The seconds cried halt and knocked up the combatants' swords with their own. The duelists sat down. A student official stepped forward, examined the wounded head, and touched the place with a sponge once or twice. The surgeon came and turned back the hair from the wound. and revealed a crimson gash 2 or 3 inches long, and proceeded to bind an oval piece of leather and a bunch of lint over it. The tally-keeper stepped up and tallied one for the opposition in his book. And the duelists took position again. A small stream of blood was flowing down the side of the injured man's head and over his shoulder and down his body to the floor, but he did not seem to mind this. The word was given, and they plunged at each other as fiercely as before. Once more the blows rained and rattled and flashed. Every few moments the quick-eyed seconds would notice that a sword was bent. Then they called halt, struck up the contending weapons, and an assisting student straightened the bent one. The wonderful turmoil went on. Presently a bright spark sprung from a blade, and that blade, broken in several pieces, sent one of its fragments flying to the ceiling. A new sword was provided and the fight proceeded. The exercise was tremendous, of course, and in time the fighters began to show great fatigue. They were allowed to rest a moment every little while. They got other rests by wounding each other, for then they could sit down while the doctor applied the lint and bandages. The law is that the battle must continue 15 minutes if the men can hold out, and as the pauses do not count, this duel was protracted to 20 or 30 minutes, I judged. At last, it was decided that the men were too much wearied to do battle longer. They were led away drenched with crimson from head to foot. That was a good fight, but it could not count, partly because it did not last the lawful 15 minutes of actual fighting, and partly because neither man was disabled by his wound. It was a drawn battle, and corps law requires that drawn battles shall be refought as soon as the adversaries are well of their hurts. During the conflict, I had talked a little now and then with a young gentleman of the White Cap Corps, and he had mentioned that he was to fight next, and had also pointed out his challenger, a young gentleman who was leaning against the opposite wall smoking a cigarette and restfully observing the duel then in progress. My acquaintanceship with a party to the coming contest had the effect of giving me a kind of personal interest in it. I naturally wished he might win, and it was the reverse of pleasant to learn that he probably would not, because, although he was a notable swordsman, the challenger was held to be his superior. The duel presently began, and in the same furious way which had marked the previous one. I stood close by, but could not tell which blows told and which did not. They fell and vanished so like flashes of light. They all seemed to tell. The swords always bent over the opponents' heads, from the forehead back over the crown, and seemed to touch all the way. But it was not so. A protecting blade, invisible to me, was always interposed between. At the end of 10 seconds, each man had struck 12 or 15 blows, and warded off 12 or 15, and no harm done. Then a sword became disabled, and a short rest followed, whilst a new one was brought. Early in the next round, the White Corps student got an ugly wound on the side of his head, and gave his opponent one like it. In the third round, the latter received another bad wound in the head, and the former had his underlip divided. After that, the White Corps student gave many severe wounds, but got none of the consequence in return. At the end of 5 minutes from the beginning of the duel, the surgeon stopped it. The challenging party had suffered such injuries that any addition to them might be dangerous. These injuries were a fearful spectacle, but are better left undescribed. So, against expectation, my acquaintance was the victor. Chapter 6. A sport that sometimes kills. The third duel was brief and bloody. The surgeon stopped it when he saw that one of the men had received such bad wounds that he could not fight longer without endangering his life. The fourth duel was a tremendous encounter, but at the end of 5 or 6 minutes, the surgeon interfered once more, another man so severely hurt as to render it unsafe to add to his harms. I watched this engagement as I watched the others, with rapt interest and strong excitement, and with a shrink and a shudder for every blow that laid open a cheek or a forehead, and a conscious paling of my face when I occasionally saw a wound of a yet more shocking nature inflicted. My eyes were upon the loser of this duel when he got his last and vanquishing wound. It was in his face, and it carried away his, but no matter, I must not enter into details. I had but a glance, and then turned quickly, but I would not have been looking at all if I had known what was coming. No, that is probably not true. One thinks he would not look if he knew what was coming, but the interest and the excitement are so powerful that they would doubtless conquer all other feelings. And so, under the fierce exhilaration of the clashing steel, he would yield and look after all. Sometimes spectators of these duels faint, and it does seem a very reasonable thing to do, too. Both parties to this fourth duel were badly hurt so much that the surgeon was at work upon them nearly or quite an hour, a fact which is suggestive. But this waiting interval was not wasted in idleness by the assembled students. It was past noon, therefore they ordered their landlord downstairs to send up hot beefsteaks, chickens, and such things, and these they ate, sitting comfortable at the several tables, whilst they chatted, disputed, and laughed. Door to the surgeon's room stood open meantime, but the cutting, sewing, splicing, and bandaging going on in there in plain view did not seem to disturb anyone's appetite. I went in and saw the surgeon labor a while, but could not enjoy. It was much less trying to see the wounds given and received than to see them mended. The stir and turmoil and the music of the steel were wanting here. One's nerves were wrung by this grisly spectacle, whilst the duel's compensating pleasurable thrill was lacking. Finally the doctor finished, and the men who were to fight the closing battle of the day came forth. A good many dinners were not completed, yet, but no matter, they could be eaten cold after the battle, therefore everybody crowded forth to see. This was not a love duel, but a satisfaction affair. These two students had quarreled and were here to settle it. They did not belong to any of the corps, but they were furnished with weapons and armor and permitted to fight here by the 5 corps as a courtesy. Evidently, these two young men were unfamiliar with the dueling ceremonies, though they were not unfamiliar with the sword. When they were placed in position, they thought it was time to begin, and then did begin, too, and with a most impetuous energy, without waiting for anybody to give the word. This vastly amused the spectators, and even broke down their studied and courtly gravity and surprised them into laughter. Of course, the seconds struck up the swords and started the duel over again. At the word, the deluge of blows began, but before long the surgeon once more interfered, for the only reason which ever permits him to interfere, and the day's war was over. It was now 2 in the afternoon, and I had been present since 9:30 in the morning. The field of battle was indeed a red one by this time, but some sawdust soon righted that. There had been one duel before I arrived. In it, one of the men received many injuries, while the other one escaped without a scratch. I had seen the heads and faces of 10 youths gashed in every direction by the keen 2-edged blades, and yet had not seen a victim wince, nor heard a moan, or detected any fleeting expression which confessed the sharp pain the hurts were inflicting. This was good fortitude, indeed. Such endurance is to be expected in savages and prize fighters, for they are born and educated to it. But to find it in such perfection in these gently bred and kindly-natured young fellows is matter for surprise. It was not merely under the excitement of the sword-play that this fortitude was shown. It was shown in the surgeon's room, where an uninspiring quiet reigned, and where there was no audience. The doctor's manipulations brought out neither grimaces nor moans, and in the fights it was observable that these lads hacked and slashed with the same tremendous spirit after they were covered with streaming wounds which they had shown in the beginning. The world in general looks upon the college duels as very farcical affairs. True, but considering that the college duel is fought by boys, that the swords are real swords, and that the head and face are exposed, it seems to me that it is a farce which had quite a grave side to it. People laugh at it mainly because they think the student is so covered up with armor that he cannot be hurt. But it is not so. His eyes and ears are protected, but the rest of his face and head are bare. He can not only be badly wounded, but his life is in danger, and he would sometimes lose it but for the interference of the surgeon. It is not intended that his life shall be endangered. Fatal accidents are possible, however. For instance, the student's sword may break, and the end of it fly up behind his antagonist's ear and cut an artery which could not be reached if the sword remained whole. This has happened sometimes, and death has resulted on the spot. Formerly, the student's armpits were not protected, and at that time the swords were pointed, whereas they are blunt now, so an artery in the armpit was sometimes cut, and death followed. Then in the days of sharp-pointed swords, a spectator was an occasional victim. The end of a broken sword flew 5 or 10 feet and buried itself in his neck or his heart, and death ensued instantly. The student duels in Germany occasion 2 or 3 deaths every year now, but this arises only from the carelessness of the wounded men. They eat or drink imprudently or commit excesses in the way of overexertion. Inflammation sets in and gets such a headway that it cannot be arrested. Indeed, there is blood and pain and danger enough about the college duel to entitle it to a considerable degree of respect. All the customs, all the laws, all the details pertaining to the student duel are quaint and naive. The grave, precise, and courtly ceremony with which the thing is conducted invests it with a sort of antique charm. This dignity and these knightly graces suggest the tournament, not the prize fight. The laws are as curious as they are strict. For instance, the duelist may step forward from the line he is placed upon, if he chooses, but never back of it. If he steps back of it, or even lanes back, it is considered that he did it to avoid a blow or contrive an advantage, so he is dismissed from his corps in disgrace. It would seem natural to step from under a descending sword unconsciously and against one's will and intent, yet this unconsciousness is not allowed. Again, if under the sudden anguish of a wound the receiver of it makes a grimace, he falls some degrees in the estimation of his fellows. His corps are ashamed of him. They call him Herr Foot, which is the German equivalent for chicken-hearted. Chapter 7. How Bismarck Fought. In addition to the core laws, there are some core usages which have the force of laws. Perhaps the president of a corps notices that one of the membership who is no longer an exempt, that is a freshman, has remained a sophomore some little time without volunteering to fight. Some day, the president, instead of calling for volunteers, will appoint this sophomore to measure swords with a student of another corps. He is free to decline. Everybody says so. There is no compulsion. This is all true, but I have not heard of any student who did decline. To decline and still remain in the corps would make him unpleasantly conspicuous, and properly so, since he knew, when he joined, that his main business as a member would be to fight. No, there is no law against declining, except the law of custom, which is confessedly stronger than written law everywhere. The 10 men whose duels I had witnessed did not go away when their hurts were dressed, as I had supposed they would, but came back, one after another, as soon as they were free of the surgeon, and mingled with the assemblage in the dueling room. The white-cap student who won the second fight witnessed the remaining 3 and talked with us during the intermissions. He could not talk very well, because his opponent's sword had cut his underlip in 2, and then the surgeon had sewed it together and overlaid it with a profusion of white plaster patches. Neither could he eat easily, still he contrived to accomplish a slow and troublesome luncheon while the last duel was preparing. The man who was the worst hurt of all played chess while waiting to see this engagement. A good part of his face was covered with patches and bandages, and all the rest of his head was covered and concealed by them. It is said that the student likes to appear on the street and in other public places in this kind of array, and that this predilection often keeps him out when exposure to rain or sun is a positive danger for him. Newly bandaged students are a very common spectacle in the public gardens of Heidelberg. It is also said that the student is glad to get wounds in the face, because the scars they leave will show so well there. And it is also said that these face wounds are so prized that youths have even been known to pull them apart from time to time and put red wine in them to make them heal badly and leave as ugly a scar as possible. It does not look reasonable, but it is roundly asserted and maintained nevertheless. I am sure of one thing: scars are plenty enough in Germany among the young men, and very grim ones they are too. They crisscross the face in angry red welts and are permanent and ineffaceable. Some of these scars are of a very strange and dreadful aspect, and the effect is striking when several such accent the milder ones, which form a city map on a man's face. They suggest the burned district then. We had often noticed that many of the students wore a colored silk band or ribbon diagonally across their breasts. It transpired that this signifies that the wearer has fought 3 duels in which a decision was reached, duels in which he either whipped or was whipped, for drawn battles do not count. After a student has received his ribbon, he is free. He can cease from fighting without reproach, except someone insult him. His president cannot appoint him to fight. He can volunteer if he wants to, or remain quiescent if he prefers to do so. Statistics show that he does not prefer to remain quiescent. They show that the duel has a singular fascination about it somewhere, for these free men, so far from resting upon the privilege of the badge, are always volunteering. A corps student told me it was of record that Prince Bismarck fought 32 of these duels in a single summer term when he was in college. So he fought 29 after his badge had given him the right to retire from the fight from my diary. Dined in a hotel a few miles up the Neckar, in a room whose walls were hung all over with framed portrait groups of the five corps. Some were recent, but many antedated photography and were pictured in lithography. The dates ranged back to 40 or 50 years ago. Nearly every individual wore the ribbon across his breast. In one portrait group representing, as each of these pictures did, an entire corps, I took pains to count the ribbons. There were 27 members, and 21 of them wore that significant badge. The statistics may be found to possess interest in several particulars. 2 days in every week are devoted to dueling. The rule is rigid that there must be 3 duels on each of these days. There are generally more, but there cannot be fewer. There were 6 the day I was present. Sometimes there are 7 or 8. It is insisted that 8 duels a week, 4 for each of the 2 days, is too low an average to draw a calculation from, but I will reckon from that basis, preferring an understatement to an overstatement of the case. This requires about 480 or 500 duelists a year, for in summer the college term is about 3.5 months, and in winter it is 4 months and sometimes longer. Of the 750 students in the university at the time I am writing of, only 80 belong to the 5 corps, and it is only these corps that do the dueling. Occasionally other students borrow the arms and battleground of the 5 corps in order to settle a quarrel, but this does not happen every dueling day. Consequently, 80 youths furnish the material for some 250 duels a year. This average gives 6 fights a year to each of the 80. This large work could not be accomplished if the badge holders stood upon their privilege and ceased to volunteer. Of course, where there is so much fighting, the students make it a point to keep themselves in constant practice with the foil. One often sees them, at the tables in the castle grounds, using their whips or canes to illustrate some new sword trick which they have heard about. And between the duels, on the day whose history I have been writing, the swords were not always idle. Every now and then we heard a succession of the keen, hissing sounds which the sword makes when it is being put through its paces in the air, and this informed us that a student was practicing. Necessarily, this unceasing attention to the art develops an expert occasionally. He becomes famous in his own university. His renown spreads to other universities. He is invited to Göttingen to fight with a Göttingen expert. If he is victorious, he will be invited to other colleges, or those colleges will send their experts to him. Americans and Englishmen often join one or another of the 5 corps. A year or 2 ago, the principal Heidelberg expert was a big Kentuckian. He was invited to the various universities and left a wake of victory behind him all about Germany. But at last, a little student in Strasbourg defeated him. There was formerly a student in Heidelberg who had picked up somewhere and mastered a peculiar trick of cutting up under instead of cleaving down from above. While the trick lasted, he won in 16 successive duels in his university, but by that time, observers had discovered what his charm was and how to break it, therefore his championship ceased. A rule which forbids social intercourse between members of different corps is strict. In the dueling house, in the parks, on the street, and anywhere and everywhere that the students go, caps of a color group themselves together. If all the tables in a public garden were crowded but one, and that one had 2 red-capped students at it and 10 vacant places, the yellow caps, the blue caps, the white caps, and the green caps, seeking seats, would go by that table and not seem to see it, nor seem to be aware that there was such a table in the grounds. The student by whose courtesy we had been enabled to visit the dueling place wore the white cap Prussian corps. He introduced us to many white caps, but to none of another color. The corps etiquette extended even to us, who were strangers, and required us to group with the white corps only and speak only with the white corps while we were their guests, and keep aloof from the caps of the other colors. Once I wished to examine some of the swords, but an American student said, "It would not be quite polite. These now in the windows all have red hilts or blue. They will bring in some with white hilts presently, and those you can handle freely." When a sword was broken in the first duel, I wanted a piece of it, but its hilt was the wrong color, so it was considered best, and politest to await a proper season. It was brought to me after the room was cleared, and I will now make a life-size sketch of it by tracing a line around it with my pen to show the width of the weapon. The length of these swords is about 3 feet, and they are quite heavy. One's disposition to cheer, during the course of the duels or at their close, was naturally strong, but court etiquette forbade any demonstrations of this sort. However brilliant a contest or a victory might be, no sign or sound betrayed that anyone was moved. A dignified gravity and repression were maintained at all times. When the dueling was finished, and we were ready to go, the gentlemen of the Prussian corps to whom we had been introduced took off their caps in the courteous German way, and also shook hands. Their brethren of the same order took off their caps and bowed, but without shaking hands. The gentlemen of the other corps treated us just as they would have treated white caps. They fell apart, apparently unconsciously, and left us an unobstructed pathway, but did not seem to see us or know we were there. If we had gone thither the following week as guests of another corps, the white caps, without meaning any offense, would have observed the etiquette of their order and ignored our presence. How strangely are comedy and tragedy blended in this life. I had not been home a full half-hour after witnessing those playful sham duels, when circumstances made it necessary for me to get ready immediately to assist personally at a real one, a duel with no effeminate limitation in the matter of results, but a battle to the death. An account of it, in the next chapter, will show the reader that duels between boys, for fun, and duels between men in earnest are very different affairs. Transcriber's note for edition 12. On the advice of 2 German-speaking volunteers, the German letters a, o, and u with umlauts have been rendered as I, o, and u instead of as variously a, o, and u, as in previous editions. Chapter 8. The Great French Duel. I second Gambetta in a terrific duel. Much as the modern French duel is ridiculed by certain smart people, it is in reality one of the most dangerous institutions of our day. Since it is always fought in the open air, the combatants are nearly sure to catch cold. Paul de Cassagnac, the most inveterate of the French duelists, had suffered so often in this way that he is at last a confirmed invalid, and the best physician in Paris has expressed the opinion that if he goes on dueling for 15 or 20 years more, unless he forms the habit of fighting in a comfortable room where damps and drafts cannot intrude, he will eventually endanger his life. This ought to moderate the talk of those people who are so stubborn in maintaining that the French duel is the most health-giving of recreations because of the open-air exercise it affords. And it ought also to moderate that foolish talk about French duelists and socialist-hated monarchs being the only people who are immortal. But it is time to get at my subject. As soon as I heard of the late fiery outbreak between M. Gambetta and M. Fortu in the French Assembly, I knew that trouble must follow. I knew it because a long personal friendship with M. Gambetta revealed to me the desperate and implacable nature of the man. Vast as are his physical proportions, I knew that the thirst for revenge would penetrate to the remotest frontiers of his person. I did not wait for him to call on me, but went at once to him. As I had expected, I found the brave fellow steeped in a profound French calm. I say French calm because French calmness and English calmness have points of difference. He was moving swiftly back and forth among the debris of his furniture, now and then staving chance fragments of it across the room with his foot, grinding a constant grist of curses through his set teeth, and halting every little while to deposit another handful of his hair on the pile which he had been building of it on the table. He threw his arms around my neck, bent me over his stomach to his breast, kissed me on both cheeks, hugged me 4 or 5 times, and then placed me in his own armchair. As soon as I had got well again, we began business at once. I said I supposed he would wish me to act as his second, and he said, of course. I said I must be allowed to act under a French name so that I might be shielded from obloquy in my country in case of fatal results. He winced here, probably at the suggestion that dueling was not regarded with respect in America. However, he agreed to my requirement. This accounts for the fact that in all the newspaper reports M. Gambetta's second was apparently a Frenchman. First, we drew up my principal's will, I insisted upon this and stuck to my point. I said I had never heard of a man in his right mind going out to fight a duel without first making his will. He said he had never heard of a man in his right mind doing anything of the kind. When he had finished the will, he wished to proceed to a choice of his last words. He wanted to know how the following words, as a dying exclamation, struck me. I die for my God, for my country, for freedom of speech, for progress, and the universal brotherhood of man. I objected that this would require too lingering a death. It was a good speech for a consumptive, but not suited to the exigencies of the field of honor. We wrangled over a good many ante-mortem outbursts, but I finally got him to cut his obituary down to this, which he copied into his memorandum book, purposing to get it by heart. I die that France might live. I said that this remark seemed to lack relevancy, but he said relevancy was a matter of no consequence in last words. What you wanted was thrill. The next thing in order was the choice of weapons. My principal said he was not feeling well and would leave that and the other details of the proposed meeting to me. Therefore, I wrote the following note and carried it to M. Fortu's friend. Sir M. Gambetta accepts M. Fortu's challenge and authorizes me to propose Plessespice as the place of meeting, tomorrow morning at daybreak as the time, and axes as the weapons. I am, sir, with great respect, Mark Twain. M. Fortu's friend read this note and shuddered. Then he turned to me and said, with a suggestion of severity in his tone, "Have you considered, sir, what would be the inevitable result of such a meeting as this?" "Well, for instance, what would it be?" "Bloodshed." "That's about the size of it," I said. "Now, if it is a fair question, what was your side proposing to shed?" I had him there. He saw he had made a blunder, so he hastened to explain it away. He said he had spoken jestingly. Then he added that he and his principal would enjoy axes and indeed prefer them, but such weapons were barred by the French code, and so I must change my proposal. I walked the floor, turning the thing over in my mind, and finally it occurred to me that Gatling guns at 15 paces would be a likely way to get a verdict on the field of honor. So I framed this idea into a proposition. But it was not accepted. The code was in the way again. I proposed rifles, then double-barreled shotguns, then Colt's Navy revolvers. These being all rejected, I reflected a while and sarcastically suggested brickbats at 3/4 of a mile. I always hate to fool away a humorous thing on a person who has no perception of humor, and it filled me with bitterness when this man went soberly away to submit the last proposition to his principal. He came back presently and said his principal was charmed with the idea of brickbats at 3/4 of a mile, but must decline on account of the danger to disinterested parties passing between them. Then I said, "Well, I am at the end of my string now. Perhaps you would be good enough to suggest a weapon. Perhaps you have even had one in your mind all the time." His countenance brightened, and he said with alacrity, "Oh, without doubt, monsieur." So he fell to hunting in his pockets, pocket after pocket, and he had plenty of them, muttering all the while, "Now, what could I have done with them?" At last he was successful. He fished out of his vest pocket a couple of little things which I carried to the light and ascertained to be pistols. They were single-barreled and silver-mounted, and very dainty and pretty. I was not able to speak for emotion. I silently hung one of them on my watch chain and returned the other. My companion in crime now unrolled a postage stamp containing several cartridges and gave me one of them. I asked if he meant to signify by this that our men were to be allowed but one shot apiece. He replied that the French code permitted no more. I then begged him to go and suggest a distance, for my mind was growing weak and confused under the strain which had been put upon it. He named 65 yards. I nearly lost my patience. I said, 65 yards with these instruments? Squirt guns would be deadlier at 50. Consider, my friend, you and I are banded together to destroy life, not make it eternal. But with all my persuasions, all my arguments, I was only able to get him to reduce the distance to 35 yards, and even this concession he made with reluctance, and said with a sigh, "I wash my hands of this slaughter. on your head be it. There was nothing for me but to go home to my old lion hut and tell my humiliating story. When I entered, M. Gambetta was laying his last lock of hair upon the altar. He sprang toward me, exclaiming, "You have made the fatal arrangements. I see it in your eye." "I have." His face paled a trifle, and he leaned upon the table for support. He breathed thick and heavily for a moment or two, so tumultuous were his feelings. Then he hoarsely whispered, the weapon, quick, what is the weapon?" This, and I displayed that silver-mounted thing. He cast but one glance at it, then swooned ponderously to the floor. When he came to, he said mournfully, "The unnatural calm to which I have subjected myself has told upon my nerves, but away with weakness. I will confront my fate like a man and a Frenchman." He rose to his feet and assumed an attitude which for sublimity has never been approached by man and has seldom been surpassed by statues. Then he said, in his deep bass tones, "Behold, I am calm, I am ready. Reveal to me the distance." 35 yards. I could not lift him up, of course, but I rolled him over and poured water down his back. He presently came to and said, 35 yards, without arrest. But why ask? Since murder was that man's intention, why should he palter with small details? But mark you one thing, in my fall the world shall see how the chivalry of France meets death. After a long silence he asked, was nothing said about that man's family standing up with him as an offset to my bulk? But no matter, I would not stoop to make such a suggestion. If he is not noble enough to suggest it himself, he is welcome to this advantage, which no honorable man would take. He now sank into a sort of stupor of reflection which lasted some minutes, after which he broke silence with, "The hour, what is the hour fixed for the collision?" "Dawn tomorrow." He seemed greatly surprised and immediately said, "Insanity, I never heard of such a thing. Nobody is abroad at such an hour." "That is the reason I named it. Do you mean to say you want an audience?" "It is no time to bandy words. I am astonished that M. Fortu should ever have agreed to so strange an innovation. Go at once and require a later hour." I ran downstairs, threw open the front door, and almost plunged into the arms of M. Fortu's second. He said, "I have the honor to say that my principal strenuously objects to the hour chosen, and begs you will consent to change it to 9:30. Any courtesy, sir, which it is in our power to extend, is at the service of your excellent principal. We agree to the proposed change of time. I beg you to accept the thanks of my client." Then he turned to a person behind him and said, "You hear, M. Noir, the hour is altered to 9:30. Whereupon M. Noir bowed, expressed his thanks, and went away. My accomplice continued, "If agreeable to you, your chief surgeons and ours shall proceed to the field in the same carriage as is customary." "It is entirely agreeable to me, and I am obliged to you for mentioning the surgeons, for I am afraid I should not have thought of them. How many shall I want? I suppose 2 or 3 will be enough." 2 is the customary number for each party. I refer to chief surgeons, but considering the exalted positions occupied by our clients, it will be well and decorous that each of us appoint several consulting surgeons from among the highest in the profession. These will come in their own private carriages. Have you engaged a hearse? Bless my stupidity, I never thought of it. I will attend to it right away. I must seem very ignorant to you, but you must try to overlook that, because I have never had any experience of such a swell duel as this before. I have had a good deal to do with duels on the Pacific coast, but I see now that they were crude affairs. A hearse show, we used to leave the elected lying around loose and let anybody cord them up and cart them off that wanted to. Have you anything further to suggest? Nothing, except that the head undertakers shall ride together, as is usual. The subordinates and mutes will go on foot, as is also usual. I will see you at 8 o'clock in the morning, and we will then arrange the order of the procession. I have the honor to bid you a good day." I returned to my client, who said, "Very well. At what hour is the engagement to begin?" 9:30. Very good indeed. Have you sent the fact to the newspapers? Sir, if after our long and intimate friendship you can, for a moment deem me capable of so base a treachery. Tut tut, what words are these, my dear friend? Have I wounded you? Ah, forgive me, I am overloading you with labor. Therefore go on with the other details and drop this one from your list. The bloody-minded Fortu will be sure to attend to it, or I myself. Yes, to make certain, I will drop a note to my journalistic friend, M. Noir. Oh, come to think of it, you may save yourself the trouble. That other second has informed M. Noir. I might have known it. It is just like that Fortu, who always wants to make a display. At 9:30 in the morning, the procession approached the field of Plessis-Piquet in the following order. First came our carriage, nobody in it, but M. Gambetta and myself. Then a carriage containing M. Fortu and his second. Then a carriage containing two poet-orators who did not believe in God, and these had MS. Funeral orations projecting from their breast pockets. Then a carriage containing the head surgeons and their cases of instruments. Then 8 private carriages containing consulting surgeons. Then a hack containing a coroner. Then the 2 hearses. Then a carriage containing the head undertakers. Then a train of assistants and mutes on foot. And after these came plodding through the fog a long procession of camp followers, police, and citizens generally. It was a noble turnout, and would have made a fine display if we had had thinner weather. There was no conversation. I spoke several times to my principal, but I judge he was not aware of it, for he always referred to his notebook and muttered absently, "I die that France might live." Arrived on the field, my fellow second and I paced off the 35 yards and then drew lots for choice of position. This latter was but an ornamental ceremony, for all the choices were alike in such weather. These preliminaries being ended, I went to my principal and asked him if he was ready. He spread himself out to his full width and said in a stern voice, "Ready, let the batteries be charged." The loading process was done in the presence of duly constituted witnesses. We considered it best to perform this delicate service with the assistance of a lantern on account of the state of the weather. We now placed our men. At this point, the police noticed that the public had massed themselves together on the right and left of the field. They therefore begged a delay while they should put these poor people in a place of safety. The request was granted. The police having ordered the 2 multitudes to take positions behind the duelists, we were once more ready. The weather growing still more opaque, it was agreed between myself and the other second that before giving the fatal signal we should each deliver a loud whoop to enable the combatants to ascertain each other's whereabouts. I now returned to my principal and was distressed to observe that he had lost a good deal of his spirit. I tried my best to hearten him. I said, "Indeed, sir, things are not as bad as they seem. Considering the character of the weapons, the limited number of shots allowed, the generous distance, the impenetrable solidity of the fog, and the added fact that one of the combatants is one-eyed and the other cross-eyed and nearsighted, it seems to me that this conflict need not necessarily be fatal. There are chances that both of you may survive. Therefore, cheer up, do not be downhearted." This speech had so good an effect that my principal immediately stretched forth his hand and said, "I am myself again, give me the weapon." I laid it, all lonely and forlorn, in the center of the vast solitude of his palm. He gazed at it and shuddered, and still mournfully contemplating it, he murmured in a broken voice, "Alas, it is not death I dread, but mutilation."